So we're looking at Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 through 8 today. And as I've said, every week that we've looked at each of the topics, Paul is continuing to focus on the church. His main statement that begins this section of the book was in chapter 4, verse 1. He continues that in 4:17 and 5:1. Basically, that we would walk according to our calling, that we would walk as Christians should, and not as heathens do, as non-Christians do. Then he has this particular focus that he began in chapter 5, verse 21 about mutual submission within the church. So he continues then from 521 by focusing on different household relationships. We already looked at marriage and looked at the parent-child relationship, and now he's continuing with the slave-master relationship. And we need to remember this textual context that Paul is using, but also the household context. And in addition, the particular chronological context is important to understand why Paul says what he does. So textually, Paul is specifically writing to the church. He is encouraging Christians to behave like Christians and not like pagans, so that they would demonstrate their new identity in their relationships. And the focus from 521 is on mutual submission. We saw that especially in the marriage relationship, but also even in the parent-child relationship. Now he turns to the slave-master relationship with instructions both for Christian slaves and Christian masters. Of course, the best case scenario, as with the two previous spheres, would be when both slaves and masters were Christians, as was the case in Philemon's household. In the Greco-Roman context, the historical context, approximately 30 to 40%, or about 60 million people of the 30-40% of the population, about 60 million people, were slaves. Many of these slaves were household slaves, and they lived right along with the family. A rich family could own and house even hundreds of slaves, actually. Of course, there were vast differences in how these slaves were treated, with some being treated as part of the family, and even in rare instances being adopted into the family. In other cases, the slaves could be treated very cruelly. But the important thing to remember is that they were part of the household, sometimes living in close proximity to the rest of the family. Now, of course, there were many other slaves, from the worst possibilities of working in the mines or prostitution to highly educated public servants who were allowed to even earn money for their work. Here, just as in Colossians chapter 3, verse 22 through 4:1, with a parallel passage to this one in Ephesians, Paul says much more to slaves than he does to masters, which quite possibly is a reflection of what he knows about his readers, a reflection of the congregations that would read this letter, because we know that the vast majority of the early church was made up of slaves, very few masters. Then the chronological context becomes important as we consider how Paul treats the institution of slavery. You see, Paul is expecting an immediate return by Christ that, of course, will eternally abolish slavery. So he sees no need for some kind of a political or legal challenge to the institution of slavery. However, his instructions here, also in the letter to Philemon, and in his statements of equality, there is no male nor female, no slave nor free, within the church, are a radical challenge to the underlying values that produced the institution of slavery. And it was these values that eventually led to slavery being outlawed in the Christian context, in the Western world, really. Now, I realize that took hundreds of years. Slavery still exists in many parts of the world, and throughout history, the church, Christians sometimes, many times, supported slavery. Those things are all true. But it's those fundamental values that Paul introduced that did bring about an abolition of slavery, at least in the Western world. And slavery is no longer considered acceptable by most of the world. But the fact does remain. Paul does not here attempt to abolish slavery. And in fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 17 through 24, he includes slavery among the three situations where Christians were urged to remain, along with marriage, even if it's marriage to an unbeliever, and circumcision, if they were circumcised or not circumcised, that they did not need to change that state just because they were Christians now. Within the context of marriage or parent-child relationship, I think it was easy to understand our responsibility and application. In these verses, however, verses 5 through 9, it also affects masters, we have to make a journey in time, some time travel in a sense, to understand how to apply his words today, unless we are slaves or masters today. But I doubt that anyone who is watching this really falls into that category. Whatever you think about your employment, your boss, or your government, we're not slaves today. Our situation is far removed from the situation of a first century slave. However, there are principles that translate for our work relationships. So this week we'll look at the responsibilities of slaves and attempt to apply that to the employee relationship. And then next week we'll look at masters or employers. First, what does Paul say here? Then, as we're using the same plan that we've used for the last few sermons. What else does the Bible say? How do we apply this today? And what could be some frequently asked questions? So I'll read Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 through 8. Slaves, obey your earthly master with deep respect and fear. Serve them sincerely as you would serve Christ. Try to please them all the time, not just when they are watching you. As slaves of Christ, do the will of God with all your heart. Work with enthusiasm, as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people. Remember that the Lord will reward each one of us for the good we do, whether we are slaves or free. So the submission that we see here, just as we saw with children and with wives earlier, is as to the Lord. It's not that masters replace Christ, just as husbands don't replace Christ and parents don't replace Christ. But the point is not as much about obedience to them or obedience to the masters as it is to Christ as our master. The submission is also not manipulative. It's not just when they are watching. So the slave who becomes a Christian is the Lord's freedman, although he may still belong to an earthly master. Just as the free person who becomes a Christian is Christ's slave, as Paul referred to himself many times. You see, inner freedom is not tied to external status. So we see in verse 5, slaves are to obey their masters, whether they are good or bad. They're only earthly masters. Our allegiance is to our heavenly master. And this position as slaves to Christ enables us to bear earthly slavery. The Christian slave displays respect and sincerity and treats the commands of their masters seriously. Then in verse 6, we see that this service is not just to gain favor, not to manipulate the master, not to look good in front of the master. The service is as to Christ, even when no one is looking. Then verse 7, It's enthusiastic service, as if it's to God and not to some earthly master, not to man. And this demonstrates an eagerness to serve, not reluctance. And then in verse 8, finally, there's a promise given. God will reward us. You see, earthly masters, especially when it's the slavery relationship, earthly masters might not reward us. Even in the employer-employee relationship today, we might not get the earthly rewards that we would like to, that we think we deserve for our work. But again, we're not serving completely for earthly reward, but rather for heavenly reward. So, what else does the Bible say about the slave-master relationship or about work? First of all, Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 10. Whatever you do, do well. For when you go to the grave, there will be no work or planning or knowledge or wisdom. In other words, work hard now while there's time. Colossians chapter 3, verses 22 through 25. I mentioned this passage as the parallel passage for this passage in Ephesians. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything you do. Try to please them all the time, not just when they are watching you. Serve them sincerely because of your reverent fear of the Lord. Work willingly at whatever you do, as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people. Remember that the Lord will give you an inheritance as your reward, and that the master you are serving is Christ. But if you do what is wrong, you will be paid back for the wrong you have done, for God has no favorites. Then 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. All slaves should show full respect for their masters, so they will not bring shame on the name of God and his teaching. If the masters are believers, that is no excuse for being disrespectful. Those slaves should work all the harder because their efforts are helping other believers who are well loved. And then in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, make it your goal to live a quiet life, minding your own business and working with your hands, just as we instructed you before. Then people who are not believers will respect the way you live, and you will not need to depend on others. Here, Paul goes outside the slave-master relationship and just talks about work, that we work hard so people will respect the way that we live. Then he goes back to the slave relationship again in Titus chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. Slaves must always obey their masters and do their best to please them. They must not talk back or steal, but must show themselves to be entirely trustworthy and good. Then they will make the teaching about God, our Savior, attractive in every way. By the way, we know from history that there was a special problem in Crete with stealing, common among slaves as well. And so Paul addresses this special problem in the church as well, as he writes to Titus, who was serving in the church in Crete. There's also a number of passages in Proverbs that encourage diligence and discourage laziness, which of course easily apply then for us as we look at how we are supposed to work our earthly jobs. Isaiah chapter 65, verses 17 through 25, and the book of Revelation chapter 21 through into 22, verse 5, passages about the new heaven and the new earth, indicate that work will still be part of our eternal rest. In other words, work in itself is not bad. It sounds like in heaven we will work also. We'll continue to do things that we enjoy, things that are fulfilling. So, what are some application principles then for today? Here's where we do that time travel, where we try to take what the Bible says about the slave-master relationship and apply it to the employer-employee relationship, or about work in general, and apply it to our lives today. So, first of all, Remember, you really are not serving your earthly boss, but Christ himself. Number two, remember that you are an example for those outside the church. Number three, be diligent. Don't be lazy. Respect your boss. Be sincere. Don't be manipulative of your boss. This is kind of falls along with that, but follows along with that. Don't work just to look good in front of your boss. Number nine, don't steal. By the way, this would not just apply to money, but also things or time. And number 10, be enthusiastic about your job. So perhaps that's tough to apply, but I think pretty clearly that that's what the Bible and Paul especially is calling us to do in our work relationships. Um, so let's look at five possibly frequently asked questions. First one, what if my boss is a complete idiot, a jerk, mean-spirited? Well, in light of the situation of first century slaves, it's kind of hard to find a whole lot of sympathy in the Bible for our situation when we have a boss who's a jerk. Slaves were treated much worse than employees are today, and slaves had no options to change jobs. So the answer is, if we're in a situation where we have a bad boss, first thing is suck it up. Obey what Christ says. See if your employer changes his treatment of you. If that's impossible, and sometimes it is, or if you find it impossible to follow Christ in that situation, thankfully, we do live in a time where changing employment is usually possible. Yes, I understand. It can be very difficult. Sometimes it can be very scary, but it's not like we're locked into that in the slavery relationship that they experienced in the first century when Paul was writing. Number two, what if my boss tells me to do something wrong? We actually asked this question in the other relationships beforehand. And the answer is the same as in those other relationships. In prayer, humility, and respect, obey God. Now, there are good ways and bad ways to do this. This requires wisdom and prayer. In some cases, just doing what you know is right will be sufficient. In some cases, talking to your boss, maybe encouraging him to choose the right thing, will be a good idea. And in rare cases, especially where serious laws are broken, you might have to go to the authorities. You might have to quit your job. But you can do all of this without hate, without bitterness, without revenge. Guard your heart. Question 3. What if I just can't get enthusiastic about my work? You know, actually, I understand. It happens. You need to be creative. One of my first jobs was in the restaurant Burger King, and I was 15 when I started working at Burger King. I'd just gotten my temporary permit so I could drive myself to work. Um, and working in fast food is not the most exciting job in the world. But I like to work fast. And there was another guy who also worked there. He was a couple years older than I was. He also liked to work fast. And so we built a competition where we would try to work faster than the other person. Now, our assistant manager saw this. She took advantage of that in that sometimes she would have a shift, one of the busiest times, where we would be the only two guys working preparing food. Normally, there'd be 4 or 5 people. So she saw, hey, we like to race. We raced. Yeah, made it harder work. Yeah, probably meant we made less money, but it at least made the job more interesting. Another common job for me, since my dad owned a lumber company, was that I worked in sawmills. And again, depending on what you're doing in a sawmill, it can be really boring. For quite a while, when my dad was grading lumber, my job involved picking up boards from one stack, carrying them over to another stack, and putting them down. Making sure, of course, that from this main stack, they went into the correct other stacks. Now think about that. You're doing that for 8, 10 hours a day during the summer, picking up boards, taking them to stacks. Boards, stacks, boards, stacks. There's not many things more boring than that. But, you know, I built up great muscles when I did that. I was out in the sun. I had a tan. Again, there was another guy, a guy from Mexico who also loved to race. And so Pilar and I, we'd race with our jobs, just trying to make fun out of it. So we can be creative. We can search for the good benefits that we have in our job. Question 4. What if other employees manipulate the boss or undercut you or lie, gossip, steal? I know these things all happen in jobs. Um, First of all, your responsibility is, going back to what Paul said, walk worthy of your calling. Don't do that. Secondly, you may need to, in humility, of course, challenge your coworkers. Challenge them not to do these things, to act correctly. Depending on how serious the situation is, you might need to let the boss know. And I know nobody likes to be the one to go tell the boss about what the other employers are doing. Um, and it might be necessary to find a way to do that that allows you also to keep those good relationships with your fellow employees. Maybe as a last resort, you need to change jobs. Honestly, more important than the money you make and your job security is your continued obedience to Christ. If you're unable to be obedient where you are, which actually is hard to imagine, we frequently cop out too quickly, you might need to change your job. Last question. What if I have a great employer who treats me well? Especially, what if that employer is a Christian? Well, thank God for her. Make sure she knows that you appreciate that. If they are a Christian, even more so. And it's not manipulative to display your gratitude for them as an employer. One of the jobs I had just before we came to Poland was I worked as a chimney sweep and also installed fireplaces and gas stoves. My boss was a Christian guy, known all over the city as well for his testimony, and it was wonderful to work with him. We're still really good friends. Every time I'm back in the States, I go visit him and his wife. Spent some time with them last year. It was awesome to work with such a great boss. And I told him that several times. I still tell him that. Hey, Dean, I'm so glad I had that. I guess it wound up being maybe 2 years to work for him. It was wonderful. If you have a boss like that, tell him that you appreciate working with him or her, of course. So next week, we'll look at the employers and what Paul has to say to them. So I invite you to come back next week.